It was the winter of 1944, deep in the Ardennes forest. Snow fell like ash from a dying sky, blanketing everything in white silence. The war had been raging for more than 5 years, but for the soldiers trapped in that frozen wilderness, time had lost its meaning. The Battle of the Bulge had turned the forests of Belgium into a killing ground. Men froze where they stood, shells shattered the trees like matchsticks, and the night echoed with the screams of engines, artillery, and the wounded. But amid that chaos, one story quietly unfolded, one that no official record captured, yet it lived on in the memories of those who saw it. A story about music, mercy, and what happens when humanity refuses to die, even in war's darkest hour. Private Thomas Hale was 22 years old, a tank mechanic from Manchester. He'd been fighting in Europe since D-Day, patching together Sherman tanks under fire, his hands raw and blackened by oil and frost. His unit, part of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, had been scattered by a sudden German counterattack. What was left of them, 8 men, exhausted and frostbitten, had taken refuge in an abandoned farmhouse near the village of Monshaw. The house creaked under the weight of snow. Its windows were broken, its walls pitted with bullet holes, but it offered shelter from the wind. Inside, the men huddled near a dying fire, their faces hollowed by hunger and sleepless nights. Outside, the forest groaned under the burden of winter. The only sound was the wind sighing through the pines, like a distant choir of ghosts. Hale was on watch, leaning against the frozen window frame, his rifle across his knees. The moonlight glinted off the snow, painting the world in shades of silver and black. Somewhere out there, he knew, the Germans were moving too, tired, cold, and just as desperate. The front line was chaos, nobody knew who held what ground. Around midnight, Hale heard something, footsteps crunching in the snow. He froze, heart hammering. The sound grew louder, closer. He raised his rifle and peered through the shattered window. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, hands raised. German soldiers. Young, too young. One of them stumbled, clutching his side, blood staining the snow like spilled ink. Hale shouted for his comrades, and within seconds, the farmhouse erupted into motion. Rifles were trained, safeties clicked off. The Germans didn't reach for their weapons. They just stood there, shivering in the pale light, one of them barely conscious. Nicht Skiasen, one of them cried. Wounded. Hale's commanding sergeant, an old southerner named Davis, stepped forward. They're surrendering, Hale said quietly. Davis studied them through narrowed eyes, then spat into the snow. We can't take prisoners, he muttered. We can't even feed ourselves. But then the wounded man moaned, a sound so raw, so human, that it cut through the numbness that had settled in all their hearts. After a long pause, Davis sighed. Bring them in. They led the Germans inside, stripped them of their weapons, and laid the wounded one on the floor near the fire. The man's name was Wilhelm Keller, a corporal from Cologne. The bullet had torn through his lower abdomen. Hale knelt beside him, tearing a strip from his own undershirt to bandage the wound. Don't move, he said softly. Keller didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Gratitude flickered briefly in his eyes. For the next hour, the 2 groups of enemies shared that broken farmhouse, each too exhausted to fight. The Americans watched the Germans warily, and the Germans sat silently, their eyes reflecting the firelight. The youngest of them, barely 19, kept glancing toward the corner of the room where something strange stood, a piano. It was out of tune, one leg missing, covered in dust and frost, but it was still there. Hale noticed the German boy staring at it. You play? He asked. The boy didn't understand, so Hale mimed pressing keys. The boy hesitated, then nodded. His name was Ernst Becker. Let him, Davis said finally. If the Kraut wants to freeze his fingers off on that thing, let him. Ernst rose, moved slowly toward the piano, brushing the snow off its keys. He pressed one. A dull, broken note echoed through the room. He tried another. Then another. Within moments, something strange happened. Music, fragile and imperfect, began to bloom in the silence. A simple melody, hesitant at first, then steady. Beethoven, maybe. For Elise. The familiar notes drifted through the cold air like smoke. The Americans stared. For a moment, none of them were soldiers. They were just men, listening to a sound that didn't belong in war. Even Keller, the wounded German, opened his eyes and smiled faintly. Hale leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. The melody was uneven, some keys dead, others sharp, but it was music, and it reminded them all of home. When Ernst finished, nobody spoke. The fire cracked softly, and outside the snow kept falling. Then Davis, the grizzled sergeant, whispered, "Play something else." The German boy hesitated. Then, with trembling hands, he began another tune, something soft, mournful, not classical this time. It took Hale a moment to recognize it. Silent Night. The first notes hung in the air like prayer. One by one, the Americans realized what he was playing, and something in their faces changed. They had all heard it before, in churches, in family gatherings, in better times. Davis, who hadn't smiled in weeks, leaned forward, eyes glistening. Hale found himself humming along, softly, under his breath. Across the room, one of the Germans began to sing, in German. Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The others joined in, first hesitant, then stronger. Their voices filled the farmhouse, warm and fragile against the cold wind howling outside. Hale didn't understand the words, but he knew their meaning. Peace. Home. Hope. He joined in too, humming the melody, and for a few precious minutes, there was no war. No uniforms. No enemies. Only the shared heartbeat of music. When the last note faded, silence returned, heavy and sacred. Keller was crying. So was Davis, though he turned away to hide it. Hale looked around at the faces lit by firelight and saw something he'd never seen before, understanding. Outside, the night seemed to pause. The wind died, and the forest stood still, as if even nature was listening. Morning came gray and cold. The war was still there, waiting beyond the trees. The Americans had to move, and the Germans would soon be picked up by the next patrol. But before they parted, Hale tore a page from his notebook and scribbled something. He handed it to Ernst. The boy frowned at the English words, not understanding. Hale gestured toward the piano and smiled. "Music," he said. "Always music." Ernst nodded, slipping the paper into his coat. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled from his pocket a small wooden carving, a tiny treble clef he'd whittled from a piece of rifle stock. He pressed it into Hale's hand. "Für Dyke," he said. "For you." They left the farmhouse that morning as enemies again, each disappearing into the frozen woods. Within hours, artillery fire shattered the quiet. The farmhouse burned, the piano crushed under falling beams. The war rolled on, indifferent to the small miracle that had happened inside its walls. Months later, when the war ended, Hale returned to England. He tried to forget, but sometimes, when he walked past a church at Christmas and heard "Silent Night," he felt that night in his chest again, the cold, the fear, the warmth of a song that had stopped a war, if only for a moment. In 1953, long after the guns had fallen silent, Hale received a letter with a German postmark. Inside was a short note, written in careful English. "I am alive. I kept your paper. I learned your words. I play now in a church in Cologne. When I play Silent Night, I remember the men in the farmhouse and the kindness that came with music. Ernst Becker." Enclosed was a photograph, an old piano, repaired, polished, sitting in a small church. On top of it rested a folded piece of paper, the same page Hale had written on, still legible beneath the creases and stains. Hale placed the photograph on his mantel. Every Christmas Eve until the day he died, he would sit alone in his small London flat, pour a cup of tea, and listen to the radio. When the familiar melody came on, he'd close his eyes and see that ruined farmhouse again, the flickering firelight, and the face of a German boy playing peace into existence. But the story didn't end there. In 1989, decades after both men were gone, a BBC historian researching wartime truces stumbled upon Hale's letters in an archive. She traced Ernst Becker's name through German church records and found his diary preserved by his daughter. The last entry, dated December 24, 1977, read, "Tonight, I played Silent Night on the same piano where the bombs once fell. I thought of the man from Manchester. I hope he still hears the song." The BBC aired a documentary that year called The Soldier's Piano. It showed the farmhouse ruins, the old piano restored by locals, and the surviving witnesses, villagers who remembered the night music silenced the war. One of them, an elderly Belgian woman, recalled standing outside her cottage that Christmas Eve and hearing the faint notes drifting through the snow. "I thought it was angels," she said softly, "but it was soldiers." Today, that piano sits in the War Museum in Bastogne. The plaque reads, "Played by enemies, heard by all." December 1944, proof that even in war, the human heart remembers peace. Every year, visitors gather there on Christmas Eve. Musicians, British, German, American, take turns playing Silent Night. Some are descendants of those who fought in the Ardennes. They play not for victory or defeat, but for remembrance. And in the stillness of that old museum, with snow falling outside just as it did in 1944, the notes linger in the air, fragile, beautiful, defiant. Proof that war can break cities, armies, and nations, but not the human need to connect, to forgive, to create beauty out of ruin. Because long after guns fall silent, long after the uniforms are packed away, music remains. And sometimes, all it takes to remind the world of its shared humanity, is a piano, a song, and the courage to listen.